So I've been a librarian for 30 years, and I've done a lot of research on UFOs, and I always maintain a very large collection of UFO books in every library I've worked at. As Alejandro was mentioning, it's fun to introduce people to the topic who, don't really otherwise have much exposure to it. And one of the things that I find fascinating are these early UFO cases. Of course, all of us know that UFOs have been with us a really long time. There were ancient sightings dating back to biblical times and pre-biblical times. But for some reason, the period of the 1800s in North America has always fascinated me. The Wild West, this was pre-science fiction, this was pre-air travel, this was pre-space travel, pre-rockets. So anything that was flying around in the skies in the 1800s that didn't have wings and made, chirping sounds, that is significant to UFO researchers. And luckily, we have a number of very well-documented cases. When we started looking at doing our book, The Real Cowboys and Aliens, UFO Encounters of the Old West, we looked at over 100 UFO cases from that time period, and not wanting to have a 500-page book, we trimmed it down to just a handful of them that we'll present. I'll present highlights of that today. When I'm showing folks how to use online research databases in my job as a librarian, I always do sample searches on research databases such as ProQuest and various others. And a lot of times, just for funds and just to kind of get a rise out of my audience, I'll do a UFO-related search. And the results come up on the screen. And there's a lot of information just in the general periodicals about UFO sightings and UFO theories. Well, recently I was doing a search, and an article came up from a skeptic about how he believes that almost all UFO encounters and sightings and alleged abductions, that almost all of them are based on people being overexposed to science fiction stories through television, movies, and in print. So his whole thesis is overexposure to science fiction has created in our country kind of what he calls a modern mythology of people who claim that they have these experiences. Of course, we all know that he's far off base, but one of the interesting things about talking about these early UFO cases that I'm going to present today is that argument is basically gone. Science fiction as a literary genre did not exist in the time period in which these cases took place. As I mentioned, human air travel had not been invented, and certainly nobody had a concept about rockets yet, or space travel. So what's really, really interesting is we can go back and look at these cases, and we can find specific instances of events that mirror the events of UFO sightings in our present day way back in the 1800s. We have the same sorts of events, starting off with encounters with the occupants of these strange objects, which were being reported even way back then. And I'm going to start off with a very interesting case where a cattleman in Northern California Humboldt County in 1888 reported that the Native Americans of that area had seen on many occasions, and he wrote this in his journal, the descent of a small object from the upper atmosphere, which they described as a small moon. We're assuming metallic in composition. So this small moon would descend from out of the sky, and out of the craft came these interesting looking beings that looked like normal human beings, except that they had very short hair. They wore tight-fitting silver clothing. According to the natives of that area, back in 1888, these beings were very friendly appearing, and they would wave to them in a friendly manner before closing the door to their spaceship and flying away. Now I'm going to have more to say about Mr. Wyatt's observation and Mr. Wyatt's journal in a later segment that I'm going to talk about. But for now, I'm focusing on the apparition of these strange beings associated with this small metallic moon that would come out of the sky. In Lodi, California, just a short while after the Humboldt County event, there was an interesting case where Colonel H.G. Shaw and another person that was with him saw three very tall beings come out of a cylindrical or cigar-shaped UFO that they saw hovering in the distance behind the beings over a body of water. So this was very interesting because the occupants of that ship were described as, quote, 7 feet in height and very slender. I noticed further, said Colonel Shaw, that their hands were quite small and delicate. Their feet were nearly twice as long as those of an ordinary man. Now, he also noted that instead of speaking, these incredibly strange beings uttered a warbling noise and also engaged in a monotonous chant with each other. So we have UFO occupant encounters dating back to the 1800s on record, and these are just a few of the many that we found. 1897 in Minnesota, Minnetonka, an eyewitness reported a large airship passing overhead, and even though the occupants were not seen at ground level, in other words, they didn't appear on the ground, they did notice by looking at the ship, inside the ship, they saw living persons. They said men, appeared to be men, women, and children. And all of the occupants of the ship were moving around, busily engaged, apparently in working the machinery that made the ship go. And this is a sketch that appeared in the Chicago Times-Herald. We had another case in 1897 where a dozen farmers saw an airship land in a field. And inside, they saw a 9-foot-tall humanoid entity that was reported by the local newspapers there in the area, in Saginaw, Saginaw Courier-Herald for one. And it seemed to them that this occupant of the ship was trying to communicate with them. I mean, there was an attempt to utter words, but of course, nobody could understand what he was saying. It sounded like bellowing to them. So another very interesting UFO occupant encounter from the 1800s. Here's one from Indiana. Witnesses described the occupants of an airship as midgets who spoke a language that nobody could recognize. This is an artist's conception that was done by a friend of ours, Jared Olive, who did some of the artwork for our book, based on the eyewitness testimony. The story of their encounter was reported in the local newspaper, and afterward, in this incident, these beings were referred to as foreign-tongued midgets. And then there's a case that many of us have heard about, I'm sure most of you have heard about, happened in Aurora, Texas, which is near Fort Worth, a small town, where an airship crashed in the middle of town. The inhabitants of the town came out and looked at the crash debris, and in the midst of the wreckage, metallic wreckage, they found a dead humanoid being that the local newspapers in Dallas and Fort Worth later said was, quote, not an inhabitant of this world. This case has been featured in many documentaries. Our native Texan, well-known UFO researcher for years, Mr. Jim Mars, has done exceptional work with the Aurora case. And Jim is also behind the annual celebration held now every year in the small town of Aurora regarding this incident, which I'm very fortunate to be invited to speak at this year. So, yeah, that was an amazing case, and I'll have more to say about that as my presentation goes on. So far we've seen the encounter with UFO occupants of folks in the 1800s in North America. Now we're going to look at the recovery of alien bodies, which is another waymark of UFO research, recovery of alien bodies. I mentioned Aurora just now, Aurora, Texas, and that is probably the most famous case where an alien body was reportedly recovered. This is the original article that appeared in the Dallas Morning News, April 19th, 1897. And we'll be reading excerpts from that in a minute, but I wanted to see what the original article looked like. Here's a depiction of what happened, done by my friend Neil Reeby, who did most of the illustrations for our book, The Real Cowboys Aliens. And it was basically a cylindrical object, a metallic cylinder, that came streaking down out of the sky, struck a windmill, and came to pieces in the center of town. Just to give you a point of reference here, we've got Aurora, Texas, right up where the arrow is indicating, and Fort Worth is way down on the bottom part of this map. I don't know if my laser pointer is visible, but Fort Worth is down here, and Aurora is off to the northwest. It's interesting to go to Aurora because you can visualize, I have spent a lot of time researching this incident, being that it's one of the most significant of this time period. And it's very interesting to actually go there and walk the grounds of where this happened. Just using Google Maps, the arrow that you see on top of this map is where the crash site happened. The metallic cylinder crashed into a windmill belonging to a Judge Proctor at that time. And then the burial site, the townspeople wanted to give this humanoid occupant of the craft a, quote, proper Christian burial. And so they transported the body down to where you see the bottom arrow, down to the town cemetery, which still exists today, by the way, and it has a state historical marker that's been placed at the cemetery that mentions the crash of the UFO and the recovery of a humanoid being. So that's one of the few official state historical markers that is marking a UFO incident that I know of. About 6 o'clock this morning, the early risers of Aurora were astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship, which has been sailing around the country. There were a lot of reports at that time going on about airships. People in this time period, again, this was pre-science fiction, pre-air travel, pre-space travel. They didn't know the terminology and the vocabulary that we use today to describe these things. So airship was as good a term for people to use as anything. It was traveling due north and much nearer the Earth than before. Evidently, some of the machinery was out of order, for it was making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour and gradually settling toward the Earth. It sailed over the public square. When it reached the north part of town, it collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill and went to pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank, and destroying the judge's flower garden. So this actually happened here, and when we were there this past April for the commemorative event that's held every year, we walked these grounds, and it has been confirmed that Judge Proctor did have a windmill. Skeptics over the years have claimed that the judge never had a windmill, and it has been confirmed. They found fragments of it. A lot of other elements of the story have been confirmed. So here, where you see the arrow pointing, is the approximate location of where the crash occurred. Unfortunately, currently there's a fence beyond which the public's not allowed to cross, but a few, short distance away, you can still view it. So we're talking about a UFO crash retrieval with a suspected alien being recovered from the wreckage. So this is what was said in the article about the spaceman, the Aurora spaceman. The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one aboard, and while his remains were badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. Interestingly enough, Mr. T.J. Weems, the U.S. Army Signal Service officer at this place and an authority on astronomy, gives it as his opinion that the pilot was a native of the planet Mars. Now, there was a lot, you've got to understand these incidents in historical context. As a librarian and as a researcher, I look for historical context clues. There was a lot of hubbub in the 1890s about Mars. Percival Lovell, a famous astronomer of that time period, had come up with this theory of the canals of Mars. So there, in 1895, Percival Lowell had published his book Mars, which suggested that life may have once existed upon Mars. And a year later, a year after the Aurora event, British novelist H.G. Wells wrote his famous book, War of the Worlds. A lot of people, after the book came out and became popular, have suggested that that kind of brought forth a lot of UFO stories after its publication. The suggestion that we may be invaded by aliens from another planet. But once again, that book had not yet been published before the Aurora event. And I'm wondering, H.G. Wells, and this is totally speculative on my part, but H.G. Wells kept up with all of the news reports of the day. He had read a lot of Percival Lowell's work and theories on Mars. Perhaps he might have heard about the Aurora incident, which happened a year before his book came out. I don't know. Just throwing that out there. So in Aurora, the crushed object and the remains of the humanoid being were described this way by one witness. This is from the Dallas Times-Herald, May 30th, 1973. She was one of the Mrs. Mary Evans was one of the last surviving witnesses. She was 15 at the time of the incident, and she said the pilot was torn up and killed in the crash. The men of the town who gathered his remains said he was a, quote, small man. She goes on to say the crash certainly caused a lot of excitement. Many people were frightened. They didn't know what to expect. That was years before we had any regular airplanes or other kinds of airships. In fact, airplanes had not yet taken to the skies when this incident happened. So 2 days after the crash, the Dallas Morning News published this article, which said that the pilot's funeral took place on April 18th at the Aurora Cemetery. Another newspaper, the Fort Worth Morning Register, said the pilot, who is not an inhabitant of this world, was given proper Christian burial at the Aurora Cemetery. Here you see the location of the spaceman's grave, which is currently marked by a huge stone that the city has placed there. And if you're ever down in Aurora Way in Texas, it's the southernmost entrance to the little cemetery. This on top, the picture on top is what the current grave marker looks like. I took these pictures this past April when we did the Aurora UFO conference, and there was a really interesting marker that had been there for many decades. That's the one you see in the lower right. It had a picture of an object, somebody's visual artistic representation of what the object may have been like. It was unknown what the genesis or the origin of this marker that's no longer there, that was vandalized and stolen. Nobody knows, who placed it there, but it was there for many, many years. And in the early 1970s, it disappeared. We visited the grave on April 16th, 2016. Travis Walton was with us, a number of other UFO researchers. And it was the first time that the townspeople, after, close to 120 years, it was the first time the townspeople decided to commemorate the event last year for the first time. So we were all happy that they decided to do that, even so many years after the fact. It's such an incredible story, and it's known the world over. I talked about the official state historical marker, which talks about the spaceship crash and the burial of the mysterious pilot whose body was recovered from the wreckage. Here, Travis Walton, who was the keynote speaker at last year's event, is pointing to the section that talks about the spaceship crash on this official Texas Historical Commission marker. So I've shown you that we have stories about encounters with living UFO occupants. We have stories of encounters with deceased UFO occupants that were recovered. The most notable cases that we ran across. Now, people always tell me, well, I've read some of those cases from the 1800s, and they're talking about dragons in the sky and serpents in the sky. They're not really talking about the types of UFO sightings that we get in more modern times. Well, in actuality, we had many, many cases in which high-speed metallic flying objects were observed in the skies over North America in the 1800s. So I'm just going to cite a few examples from our book about metallic flying objects. One of the best known cases from this time period, 1878, also near Dallas, Texas. As a native Texan, I'm proud to say that we found many interesting UFO cases from the 1800s that occurred in Texas. And one of the most interesting, which has been highly researched over the years, and was the basis for J. Allen Hynek's daylight disk classification in his UFO identification system, was this one that occurred in the Dallas area in 1878. A farmer named John Martin. He was out hunting one day when he spotted an extremely bright, fast-moving object in the sky that he later described as a large saucer. Now, people are surprised about this because most people assume that the word flying saucer originated with the Kenneth Arnold sighting in 1947, when in reality it was used back in the 1800s in this particular case. The local newspaper said the peculiar shape and velocity with which the object seemed to approach riveted his attention. This is the first recorded use of the term saucer, as I mentioned, and it wasn't until 69 years later that the term flying saucer officially entered into the public landscape. So in this map that I'm showing you here, there's an approximate location for where this incident happened. The newspaper article went on to say when directly over him, it was about the size of a large saucer, was evidently at great height. It went as rapidly as it had come and was soon lost to sight in the heavenly skies. And this was a case that fascinated Dr. Hynek, as I mentioned previously. Another description of a metallic UFO, Benkelman, Nebraska, 1884. I was doing this presentation in South Texas a couple years ago, and I actually had someone in the audience from near Benkelman, and she raised her hand and said, "I know where that is. I grew up not far away from there." So I thought that was amazing that in South Texas somebody would be familiar with this. June 6, 1884, a gentleman named John W. Ellis and 3 other cowboys saw a strange object streaking across the sky over them and then saw it descend and crash at a nearby ridge. The object was described as cylindrical, about 50 or 60 feet long, about 10 or 12 feet wide. It was composed of a strange metal that they later found to be extremely light. Why? Because they handled debris from the wreckage, as we will see. Later in my presentation, I'm going to talk more about the crash debris and what happened to it. But right now, I'm focusing in on fast-moving metallic objects that were seen in the 1800s. 1888, I mentioned the Humboldt County, California, the small moon that descended out of the sky was seen by the Native Americans. They told a local cattleman there that on many occasions they saw the landing of a strange airship. And the suggestion is, from reading the narrative, is that it was a bright metallic substance composing it. And the humanoid occupants of the craft wore tight-fitting silver clothing, as mentioned previously. So another metallic ship. I had previously told you about the Lodi, California sighting of November 1896, where Colonel Shaw saw those 3 tall beings standing in front of a cylindrical metallic object. Resting in the air about 20 feet above the water was this immense airship. It was 150 feet in length at least, though probably not over 20 feet in diameter at the widest part. It was pointed at both ends, and outside of a large rudder, there was no visible machinery. I'm amazed by the level of description in these very early UFO witness accounts, especially given the fact, as I've already mentioned, that they did not have the terminology about air travel and space travel and rockets, and they were never exposed to Mr. Spock on Star Trek, or, the object is generally believed to have been of metallic construction. Another metallic craft seen in the 1800s. And I've already mentioned the airship, as it was called by the townspeople, that came down in the middle of town, fell to pieces, and the Aurora spaceman was found in the debris. The airship was described as built of an unknown metal resembling somewhat a mixture of aluminum and silver, and it must have weighed several tons, according to the local newspaper. Just a side note, a hot air balloon in its deflated state weighs about 800 pounds, which is less than a ton. So the only thing really, and they were very rare, they were just beginning to be seen around the country, were hot air balloons. So the article goes on to see the town is today full of people who are viewing the wreckage and gathering specimens of strange metal from the debris. We have often wondered how many of those pieces of debris from the Aurora crash might be still floating around North Texas after all these years, maybe in people's attics. People wondering, where did this come from? So we've looked at encounters with UFO occupants. We've looked at recovery of bodies from crash sites. We've looked at metallic UFOs seen in the 1800s. Now, an interesting angle to this is the recovery of artifacts from a UFO crash site or landing site. And we have quite a number of stories from the 1800s that occurred. In the Benkelman case, which I've already mentioned, after witnessing that strange object crash on a nearby ridge, we had those 4 cowboys headed by Mr. Ellis, who went up to the ridge and they looked at the scattered debris of this object. And they found what the local newspaper later described as a strange metal that they found to be extremely light. Mr. Ellis rode at once to the spot, and it is asserted saw fragments of cogwheels. Once again, using the vocabulary of that time period, if you go back and look at descriptions of what the people at that time would have meant by cogwheels, it would have been gears and other metallic parts that fitted together. Other pieces of machinery lying on the ground scattered in the path made by the aerial visitor, glowing with heat so intense as to scorch the grass. What's really interesting, and I want to read to you just a short segment from the book, from our book, on what exactly happened with the fragments from this particular case. In its June 10th, 1884 edition, the Daily State Journal said about the debris from the crash, "It is gone, dissolved into the air. A tremendous rainstorm fell yesterday afternoon, beginning at about 2 o'clock. As it approached in regular blizzard style, most of those assembled to watch the mysterious visitor fled to shelter, a dozen or more, among them your correspondent, waited to see the effect of rain upon the glowing mass of metal. The storm came down from the north, on its crest a sheet of flying spray and a torrent of rain. It was impossible to see more than a rod through the driving, blinding mass. It lasted for half an hour, and when it slackened so that the aerolite should have been visible, it was no longer there. The draw was running 3 feet deep in water and was supposing it had floated off the strange vessel that the party crossed over at the risk of their lives to see." They were astounded to see that the queer object had melted, dissolved by the water like a spoonful of salt. Scarcely a vestige of it remained. Small, jelly-like pools stood here and there on the ground, but under the eyes of the observers, these grew thinner and thinner until they were but muddy water joining the rills that led to the current a few feet away. The air was filled with a faint, sweetish smell. And one of the criticisms of this story, by the way, from skeptics is that some of the wreckage is described as cogwheels, which is a common term in the 19th century for machinery, such as gears. But once again, my argument, or my response to this argument, is that people were using the vocabulary that they were familiar with. They didn't have any other words other than what was known at that time. So cogwheels would have been a way to describe things that look like gears, or pieces of metal that seem to fit into other pieces of metal. So we also had another interesting case where we had the recovery of artifacts from a UFO crash site. This happened in Montana in 1864. James Lumley was a fur trapper who was up in the mountains when he saw this object come streaking out of the sky and crash land about 2 miles from his camp. When he approached the object, he saw that a path had been cut through the forest several rods wide. Giant trees uprooted or broken off near the ground, the tops of hills shaved off, and the earth plowed up in many places. It appeared to him that the UFO was like a gigantic stone. Once again, he's struggling to find terminology, containing strange writing on its hull. Mr. Lumley told the newspaper reporter that the object was carved with writing similar to that of ancient Egypt. According to the newspaper account, he is confident that the hieroglyphics were the work of human hands and must have been used for some purpose by animated beings. Another UFO encounter of the 1800s involving recovery of objects. A terrific explosion shook the town of Dublin, Texas, early on a Saturday morning. Dublin is very near Stephenville, Texas, and I guess Dublin is best known as being the first place that the soft drink Dr. Pepper was bottled. Anybody ever had a Dr. Pepper? You can go and visit the original bottling plant, the location of the original bottling plant for Dr. Pepper, which was actually invented in Waco, which is just a stone's throw away as we measure distances in Texas from Dublin. So the residents of Dublin in 1891 were awakened to this, on a Saturday morning, to this hovering object above the town's cotton gin, which suddenly burst into flames. Burning hot metal fell to the ground, setting grass and weeds on fire, and an eyewitness described the debris as fragments of the most remarkable substance ever known to explode. The eyewitness said the debris was a metal of the same color as lead. So we're going to talk just briefly about these Dublin hieroglyphics. Found among the debris were several pieces of what looked like paper with strange writing on it. Dublin Progress, which is, you can still find copies of it in the library at Dublin, Texas, and the librarians were very happy to share those with us. The language was entirely foreign to him, and in fact, no one has yet been found who has ever seen such a language before, according to the local newspaper, the Dublin Progress. The strange writing bewildered the witness. In fact, if you read the newspaper article closely, he's trying to describe those symbols, that writing, and the newspaper reporter says at one point, the eyewitness becomes so emotional that he just can't continue speaking. And then I've mentioned the recovery of the crashed object in Dublin and the pilot, the Aurora spaceman. And what's interesting now is that papers were found written in an unknown language at the crash site of the Aurora event also, 1897, Aurora, Texas. The papers may have contained a record of the pilot's journeys, some guessed. The newspaper account said they were written in some unknown hieroglyphics. And here's a direct quote beneath the picture there, written by my friend Jared Olive, sketched by my friend Jared Olive. Below that is a quote from the newspaper. Papers found on his person, evidently the records of his travels, are written in some unknown hieroglyphics and cannot be deciphered. What's really, really interesting is that in many, many UFO sightings, the Roswell UFO crash of 1947 being one of the better known examples, there has been the recovery of writing samples described as hieroglyphics or symbols. I remember Dr. Jesse Marcel Jr., who did the foreword to one of my books, sitting down and talking with him at a restaurant in Roswell, and he was describing to me the strange symbols that he found on the pieces of mystery metal that his dad recovered at the Roswell, at the ranch, the Foster Ranch in Roswell. So this is like a recurring motif of UFO crash stories throughout history. What about alien abductions? We've talked about the recovery of alien bodies. We've talked about high-speed metallic craft. We've talked about seeing UFO occupants and so forth. Now, what about alien abduction? Well, we have a very interesting case. And I've already mentioned Lodi, California, Colonel H.G. Shaw and Camille Spooner. They approached these tall beings that were standing in front of the floating object, when one of the beings, at a signal from the one who appeared to be the leader, attempted to lift Colonel Shaw bodily and carry him away. It says, he attempted to lift me, probably with the intention of carrying me away. All three creatures tried, but could not budge Colonel Shaw, due to what he believed was a lack of sufficient muscle power, possibly because of the difference in gravity. But a very interesting story, and Colonel Shaw and his companions were actually very concerned that they were going to be abducted. What about cases where UFOs cause injuries or death? Yes, we have those also. 1884, Benkelman, Nebraska. The Cowboys saw that UFO crash in a nearby ridge. They rode up to it. And when they approached the crash site, one of the Cowboys sustained serious burns. Alf Williamson was his name. He dismounted and approached the UFO debris when he, quote, fell senseless from gazing at it at too close quarters. His hair was singed to a crisp, and his face was covered with blisters. This has to be one of the first UFO cases where there is a reported serious injury resulting from exposure. Mr. Williamson was dragged away from his close proximity to the wreckage and was taken to the home of John W. Ellis, the lead cowboy, where he was cared for until a doctor arrived. His condition was serious, and his brother, who lived in Denver, was summoned by telegraph. Unfortunately, I could not find in the historical record any mention of what happened to him after this incident. So it's unknown whether he later died or recovered from his serious injuries. Another case where a UFO caused serious injuries or death happened in Tacoma, Washington in July of 1893. There were some men camping on one of the small islands in the Puget Sound when they encountered a very strange object that, interestingly enough, came up from underwater and shot out bolts of electricity and streams of what the men described as electrified water. One man was struck by a burst of this strange water and instantly fell to the ground and lay as dead. When a second man tried to help this first gentleman, he too was struck and also fell senseless to the earth. It was later discovered that the men were actually not dead, but merely unconscious and otherwise unharmed. And then I've mentioned Aurora several times in the context of various aspects of this story. Another interesting aspect of Aurora, 1897, was that although it didn't happen at the time of the incident, many years later, there was a gentleman who claimed to have been afflicted after he drank water from the well in town, the water well in town, where some of the UFO wreckage was thrown down. Mr. Brawley Oates, who purchased Judge Proctor's property around 1935, he cleaned out the debris from the well in order to use it as a water source, but later developed an incredibly severe case of arthritis. You see some pictures there. And up until the point that he died, he blamed his condition on drinking contaminated water from the UFO wreckage. So as a result of that, Mr. Oates sealed up the well with a concrete slab in 1957. Now, metallic objects, UFO occupants, these are all interesting. One of the other interesting angles to these early UFO cases is that really caught my attention in reading these old newspaper articles. There were many reported sightings of strong beams of light coming down out of the sky from objects and illuminating the entire countryside below. Now that's an amazing thing when you stop to think about it. In the 1800s, when you looked around and there were maybe lanterns, gas lamps, bright sources of illumination were not known, and certainly not in an object that was flying overhead. To be able to shine a strong beam of light down to the ground that made it appear as daylight, as one of the witnesses said, was incredible to me to find those accounts. For example, in California, in November 1896, witnesses from Sacramento down to San Francisco and even as far south as Los Angeles reported seeing an airship with a powerful glowing light underneath its hull. One witness said, quote, "The machine was brilliantly lighted and the lower light shed a large arc on the ground as it passed over, while the headlight could be seen for a great distance ahead of the machine." And no such portable illumination equipment existed in this time period, especially in a moving aerial object. In 1896, electrical lights were still in their infancy. They could not yet achieve such illumination as was being reported in many of these articles. Also, there would be no way to get them in the air while supplying them with enough power to shine down so brightly while moving across the sky. Yet during this time period, there were many, many reports of brightly illuminated flying objects lighting up the night skies of California and other western states. Bigfoot, believe it or not, he makes an appearance in these early UFO narratives of the 1800s. And it's in the context of incidents that occurred in Northern California in Humboldt County. It turns out that these metallic small moons that the Native Americans saw descending out of the sky, and the humanoid figures dressed in tight-fitting silver clothing, they came here to the earth apparently for the purpose of turning loose upon us these creatures that the Native Americans described as crazy bears. From their descriptions, these large furry beasts would be what we call today Bigfoot. And I'm going to share with you. The Native Americans led Mr. Wyatt to a nearby cave where he observed a large, muscular, man-like beast whose body was almost entirely covered in long, shiny black hair. Mr. Wyatt found out that after the creatures were brought to Earth by the UFOs, the natives rounded them up, found caves for them to live in, fed them, and cared for them. The natives believed that these creatures were capable of, quote, powerful medicine. A descendant of Mr. Wyatt recently told paranormal investigator Brad Steiger that the UFOs may have been bringing the Bigfoot creatures to Earth as some type of experiment. What I find incredibly interesting is that this area in Northern California has been known for decades as a place where Bigfoot sightings occur on a regular basis. And many of the large, well-known Bigfoot sightings over the years have happened there. So this is an actual statue of Bigfoot that is in one of the national parks in that area. And there you see a map of where Humboldt County is located northwest of Sacramento. Cattle mutilations. Well, people say, UFO-related cattle mutilations, that was a phenomenon of the 1970s, right? Started in the 70s. Actually, there was an interesting report from the 1800s. In 1896, Howell County, Missouri, Pearl Chenoweth reported that she and her family watched in stunned silence as a bright circle of light appeared over their barn. After the light vanished, the family found a large burned area and 3 dead steers. The dead animals were, quote, completely drained of blood. The only marks on them were some dried blood on their throats from 2 puncture holes in the jugular vein. These looked as though they had been made by a 2-tined fork. 1896. 1897, Leroy, Kansas. According to a Kansas newspaper, rancher Alex Hamilton awoke to strange noises from outside his house. His cattle sounded as if something was scaring them badly. When he went outside, he saw a cigar-shaped object with a carriage or canopy. Inside the canopy were 3 of the strangest beings he had ever seen. He could only see them in sort of silhouette. And the strange airship suddenly dropped a long cable, snagged a calf, and began slowly hoisting the terrified animal up into the air as the ship slowly drifted away across the night sky. So, a lot of the characteristics of modern UFO sightings we find in the 1800s in North America. That's what's so incredibly interesting. Even to the point of, you've heard of unidentified submersible objects, USOs. There was this interesting sighting that I've already touched on in Tacoma, Washington, in the Puget Sound, where the strange object came up out of the water, shot bolts of electricity and streams of electrified water. 2 of the observers were struck and rendered unconscious. And the object itself, we're going to focus on now, was 150 feet long, and its body was encircled by copper rings, indicating that it was a mechanical object and not an organism. The witnesses, though, struggling in this time period for words to describe what they saw, referred to it as looking like a giant metallic caterpillar with 6 eyes and 2 horns atop its head. The horns spouted jets of water that the men described as blue fire because when the water touched 2 of the men, it caused them to pass out. The witnesses also said this monster fish seemed to have a propeller at its rear, again indicating the beast was possibly mechanical. Here's a general area of the sighting near Tacoma, and an artist's rendition of the beast. This next story I'm going to tell you is near and dear to my heart, and I have been to this location on many occasions, dating back to when I was a young person traveling West Texas, Big Bend National Park area. It's a fascinating place, unlike any other part of the state. It's actually more like Arizona and New Mexico, mountainous desert country. And it's there that there's been a Texas tradition for dating back to the 1800s of these incredibly unusual lights that appear almost every night. It's very rare when you can't see them. I mean, usually UFO sightings occur, rather randomly in places you can't predict, and you're lucky to be there to see something. But these strange lights actually appear almost every evening, beginning at sundown and continuing long into the night. Some people have referred to them as UFO landing lights, but they've been seen actually since the 1800s. And by the way, all the skeptics who say that what you're actually looking at are car headlights from a nearby state road that gets very little traffic at night, bouncing off the atmosphere and being reflected 30 or 40 miles away from where these things appear. There were no cars, I hate to break it to them, in the 1800s when these lights first started appearing. Mysterious glowing lights seen in 1883 for the first time, still seen almost every evening near Marfa, Texas. They're referred to as the Marfa lights, even though the source of the lights is not in the small town of Marfa. Most tourists go to Marfa, enjoy the amenities that the town has to offer, stay at one of the hotels in Marfa, so that they can at night go to the official state of Texas Marfa Lights viewing station and look off into the horizon toward the Chinate Mountains. And it's against the backdrop of those mountains as it gets dark that you start seeing these incredible lights. And unfortunately, many attempts I've made over the years to photograph them and videotape them do not do justice to actually seeing them. They're a spectacular sight, multicolored, spinning, glowing lights that move up and down, side to side, diminish in intensity, increase in intensity. You may see one, and then suddenly the whole horizontal sky horizon may be just full of them. And so they sparkle, they shine, they go out, they come back. Many attempts to investigate them scientifically have failed to disclose any conclusive evidence of what they may be. There are attempts to prove that they are the headlights from vehicles passing at a nearby road that connects the town of Marfa with the town of Presidio. Others say that they are gaseous emissions escaping from the Earth's crust, etc. In 1883, they were first seen by cowboy Robert Reed Ellison and several other men who were herding cattle through the area around Marfa. They saw the flickering lights, and they assumed that these were campfires that were lit by the Apache Indians of that location. Ellison and his men saddled up and rode out into the desert looking for the source. For hours they searched, and they were not able to find any tracks, any doused campfires. There was no evidence whatsoever that anybody had even been out there. And so the legend of the Marfa Lights was born, 1883. If you go down to visit West Texas, which I recommend, how many of you, has anybody been out to see the Marfa Lights? A couple of hands. All right. The eyes of Texas are upon you. This that you see here is the official viewing area on Highway 90, located just east of the small town of Marfa. And this laser pointer is really not very bright, but if you look at that map where the large red arrow is pointing, at the start of that arrow, up near Marfa, you're looking to the southeast toward the Chinate Mountains. If you take Highway 67 from Marfa down to Presidio on that map, about halfway between the two towns, you'll come really close to the Chinate Mountains. In fact, I've gotten out, and it's very interesting. And what's amazing is that it's right there all along the base of those mountains and up on the peaks and so forth that the Marfa Lights appear. I have some videos. If you go to my website, roswellbooks.com, you'll see some of the videos that I've taken over the years of the Marfa Lights. Unfortunately, all the video equipment that I've used, I've never been able to see the color, the amazing color. You see reds, greens, blues. Yeah. So it's quite a sight. Another sight, believe it or not, that many people saw in the 1800s, there were giant flying creatures. Some of these UFO researchers over the years have speculated maybe they weren't organic creatures at all. It was just that the inhabitants of this time period did not have the proper terminology to use, and so they used terms to describe an organic creature when really it's what it really was. It could have been a UFO. But we're going to talk about some of the ones that we included in our book. Fort Scott, Kansas in 1873, one of the most famous incidents where even soldiers of the U.S. cavalry stationed there at Fort Scott and many other civilian eyewitnesses saw a large serpent-like object in the skies above, causing the locals to become, quote, seriously frightened. In the same time period, a similar sky serpent, as they were being called, was also seen over Bonham, Texas, located northeast of Dallas. And other similar flying serpents were seen over Nebraska in 1857 and 1858. So, as I mentioned, a number of UFO investigators believe that these, what people were actually seeing were objects, not organic creatures. Chief of these was UFO investigator Donald Kehoe, who believed that these sky serpent sightings were actually sightings of UFOs. And one of the most famous ones occurred in Crawfordsville, Indiana in 1891, where a Methodist minister and his wife saw this huge flying creature moving through the air in a writhing, twisting manner similar to the glide of some serpents. The creature had a huge glowing eye and hundreds of fins running the length of its body. It was also seen by 2 ICE deliverymen, and on the following day, September 6th, about 100 townspeople all saw the same creature in the sky. It was about 18 feet long and about 8 feet wide and moved rapidly through the air by means of several pairs of side fins. It was pure white and had no definite shape or form, resembling somewhat a great white shroud fitted with propelling fins. There was no tail or head visible, but there was one great flaming eye. I love that description. One great flaming eye, and a sort of wheezing, plaintive sound was emitted from a mouth which was invisible. So witnesses estimated that it hovered about 300 to 400 feet above the ground, and at one point descended so close to the ground that some witnesses claimed they could feel its hot breath. Crawfordsville, Indiana. I believe they have a little small commemorative celebration there, or they used to. And this is a very nice painting of the creature that somebody did and contributed to Wikipedia. So you too can find that. The Crawfordsville Monster. What about encounter with prehistoric beasts? Yes, we find that in the 1800s as well. In 1890, near Tombstone, Arizona, 2 cowboys were riding through the desert there, just outside of town, the Huachuca Desert, when they saw resting on the ground a large winged monster with a 160-foot wingspan. The local newspaper, Tombstone Epitaph, later reported that the creature resembled, quote, a huge alligator with an extremely elongated tail and an immense pair of wings. It was hairless and featherless. The 2 cowboys became fearful and ended up shooting the creature with their Winchester rifles. And it took quite a number of well-placed shots before the winged monster was finally killed. And this is what the newspaper had to say on what happened next. Late last night, one of them, the cowboys, arrived in this city for supplies and to make the necessary preparations to skin the creature, when the hide will be sent east for examination by the eminent scientists of the day. The finder returned early this morning, accompanied by several prominent men who will endeavor to bring the strange creature to this city before it is mutilated. Nothing further, unfortunately, in all the research that I did trying to find follow-up stories, nothing further was ever reported. And we have a few minutes for questions on anything that sparks your curiosity about early UFO cases, specifically anything that I talked about today or anything that you yourself have heard. Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to ask about the presentation or about these early UFO cases? Anybody have questions? Do they step up to the microphone? Is that the routine? Okay, there's a microphone available here, and we just have time for just a couple of questions because our time is getting away from us, and it's nearly lunch. Yes, sir, step right up and be bold.
The reason that we had some of these creatures in the West is because when the humans started destroying the habitat, a lot of your so-called remnants of extinct creatures that survived the great extinctions were simply wiped out because of the loss of a habitat.
The speculation is that perhaps we invaded some of the habitat where some of these ancient or creatures or large creatures were living, and that certainly is a possibility.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Just a couple more questions. Yes, sir.
I've read critiques of these old late 1800 reports of UFOs and airships and that.
Sure.
And some of the critiques say it was kind of the style back then to come up with outrageous stories, kind of like National Enquirer type stories, and
to sell newspapers, right?
Yeah, sell newspapers, get a chuckle. Do you think we might be misinterpreting some of these stories as actually factual when they were meant as jokes?
It's just so many of them that to me it just seems, and you know, the Dallas Morning News regarding its coverage of the Aurora UFO crash, it just does not seem feasible that, I mean, there may be some of that mixed in, but I wouldn't say, I don't think that 100% of them would be. Yes, sir, step right up.
Yeah, I'm curious with the Aurora situation. Was there any attempt to exhume the alien body at all? Because that would have
There have
given
been
us good
attempts to
evidence.
exhume it, but the body, the organization, it's a private cemetery, and the organization that still owns it to this day will not permit the body to be exhumed. So they've attempted to use special equipment, ground penetrating radar, and they found, you know, something that can't be identified that's down there, but you can only do so much with the ground penetrating radar. Very good question. Yes, sir, we'll take the last question here.
I've heard of a report like where I don't remember the date or where it was, but apparently some cowboys like saw a metallic bird in the sky and they ended up firing at it, but it had no effect. In fact, it just bounced off. Have you heard of that story? If you have, like, do you know the details and what are your thoughts on it?
I didn't hear any more on that. I ran across that story and almost included it in the book. But as I mentioned, we looked at 100 well-documented cases from this time period, and we had to pick just a few, you know, the choicest ones. So I appreciate everybody being with us here today and at this wonderful conference. Look forward to seeing all of you around for the next 5 days. Have a great time.